Hello, everybody. I'm Kate Easton from the Lytton Phil, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's talk. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. So, on with tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Mitchell. She is reader in Victorian and literature and culture and director of the 19th Century Centre at the University of Birmingham. She has published widely on Victorian fashion, print culture, George Meredith, and Oscar Wilde. Her current Leverhulme-supported monograph project, Fads Forward, explores the origins of fad culture in Victorian era. So please welcome Rebecca and her talk tonight, the Victorian Fancy Dress Ball. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kay, and thanks to everyone for coming, especially on a night. Oh, I think many people are focused on the football, so I do appreciate your coming for the Victorian Fancy Dress Ball. So this talk draws on an article that I wrote for the journal Fashion History, and it aims to look at one of the mainstays of Victorian dress culture, that being the fancy dress ball. So I'm going to start by giving a little background on the history of these balls, where they come from. Before Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, I'll discuss some of the better known and best documented balls of the era before turning to the far more common middle class versions, looking at some of the ways that British and Americans participated in fancy dress during the second half of the 19th century. And as Kay mentioned, there will be time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate to drop them in the chat or raise them at the end, and I will do my best to answer them. So fancy dress balls have their basis in the earlier masquerade, the most famous of which occurred around Carnivale, or what in New Orleans, where my family is from, we call Mardi Gras, celebrating the beginning of Lent, the end of the season before Lent. So in Western Europe, including Britain, this really culminated in the 18th century masquerade. What you're seeing here is an 1809 colored engraving of one such event. Historians tend to agree that masquerades were an opportunity for revelers to cast off the strictures of polite society, using the cover of costume to allow them to defy social norms, especially sexual norms, amplifying or revealing the desires that were otherwise disallowed in polite society. Masquerades, in other words, allowed revelers to be the opposite of who they might normally be. And this was heavily dependent on disguise, on not being readable as who you are in real life. Costumes for these balls tended to be drawn from a relatively small pool of options. Some classical or allegorical figures were common, but the best known and most frequently used were the stock characters of the Italian Commedia dell'arte. What you're seeing here are some 18th century porcelains that are featuring some of these figures, which will be familiar to, I'm sure, all of you, Harlequin, Columbina, Pantaloon among them. So this tradition persisted for centuries, but with the turning of the 19th century, a shift begins to happen in both the form and the function of these balls, why people went, who went, what they were used for. So you can see early signs of this shift in Henry Parker's depiction of an 1832 Newcastle fancy dress ball. And this is a painting that's now held in Newcastle Council's collection. And actually, there's a great post on the Lytton Phil's blog about this very painting, if you're interested, by Helen Rutherford. Amongst the Newcastle luminaries depicted, one can make out a great number of historical costumes, but what's not evident here, as was evident in the previous engraving, are harlequins or dominoes. We start to not see them, they fall out of favor. And through the following decades, into the 1830s, 40s, Victorians, from the Queen herself, but through all social classes, began to see this as a common manifestation of leisure, something fun. They enjoyed costumed balls. Their aims, though, and for reasons that I'll touch on today, were fundamentally different from the masquerade balls of these previous eras. So the balls became less about disguise, less about hiding who one was, one's true self, in order to transgress social norms. And they became much more about using fancy dress as a means of expressing something about oneself. So using fancy dress as a way of exposing and explaining and manifesting yourself rather than disguising or hiding it. They were also a mainstay of the popular press, these events, and in fact, the proliferation of the press contributed to the increasing popularity of costume balls across the spectrum. That expansion was spurred on by advances in print technology, especially the reproduction of image technology, so the availability of better quality photographic reproductions and pictorial reproductions and colored reproductions in particular, but also other social contexts, like the repeal of the stamp duty, which brought the costs of popular periodicals significantly lower, and the vast increase in readership that resulted from increasing compulsory education through the second half of the 19th century. But then, as now, despite this prevalence and the expansion of readership and access to these kinds of balls, there were still a few events held by the social elite that garnered a massive amount of public attention. And I'm going to look at two with you that will serve as, I hope, nice bookends to this second half of the 19th century. And I'll start with the mid-century point, with Victoria herself. So Queen Victoria was a well-known, avid fan of fancy dress, and she held three particularly notable events right in the mid-century near the start of her reign. And each of these dictated an historical era from which guests were supposed to choose their costumes. So there was an 1842 Plantagenet ball, an 1845 Georgian ball, and an 1851 Stuart ball. No expense was spared for these occasions. The bodice of Victoria's gown that she wore for the 1842 ball was said to have been adorned with diamonds worth over £60,000 in the day. And the demand for historical accuracy was high in these costumes. For many of the attendees of these events, this could potentially mean, if you're looking at historical figures, this could potentially mean dressing up as one of their own ancestors, and many did. Now, I've mentioned that the Victorians, unlike their 18th century predecessors, tended not to use the balls primarily as a means of escape. And it might seem that insisting on inhabiting the Stuart era, for example, would very much be an escape from the 19th century. But in fact, it's clear that the fancy dress worn for these events was very much filtered through a mid-19th century lens. This is how Victorians viewed their past, as opposed to a historically accurate version of the past. And we can see that especially in the image that is before you now. This is the dress that Victoria wore for the 1851 Stuart ball. Now, even from this slide, you can tell it's gloriously made, sumptuous fabric, the lace was bespoke, and there's extraordinary attention to detail throughout the garment. It's fair to say that when you compare this to dresses as depicted from paintings from the actual Stuart era, as this one, with their farthingales and their stiff collars and very long pointed basques, this looks very different from what Victoria is wearing in 1851. And in fact, her gown looks far more akin to the gowns of her own time, such as this one. This is an 1855 example from the Metropolitan Museum with the off-the-shoulder neckline, the dropped sleeves, the pointed natural waist. In other words, what we're seeing is a Victorian version of a Stuart gown as opposed to something more accurate. But nevertheless, despite the ostensible lack of historical accuracy, her enthusiasm, Victoria's enthusiasm for fancy dress, set a standard from the start of her reign, and it helps to proliferate this idea of the ball as an acceptable and even delightful means of leisure through the end of the century. So if Victoria's balls are kind of one mid-century point that establish or help to establish the trend, the other famous example that I want to look at that caps the 19th century is perhaps the most famous of all of the famous fancy dress balls, and that's the Duchess of Devonshire's 1897 fete, which was held in honor of Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. So this event was heralded in its own time as the ultimate fancy dress outing, and the indulgent mood of the party itself was matched by the extraordinary length and expense taken to ensure that the costumes and those wearing them were recorded for posterity in their fullest splendor. So these images are, if nothing else, a reminder that in the decades since Victoria's early balls, photography as a mass medium had flourished. In this case, this is a privately printed catalog of the revelers that was commissioned, photographed by James Lauder of the Lafayette Company and sumptuously bound. This volume is the most formal documentation of the event, but with newspapers able to reproduce these images, the ball was one of the best documented outings of the period. Like Victoria's balls, there was the expectation that attendees' costumes should be accurate. So the notion of accuracy was quite emphasized in the press at the time. And a quick glance at the album shows that while some attendees did try to hew closely to historical precedent, many rendered their historical personage or their mythological character of choice very much in the fashion vocabulary that they knew best, that being their own. So these tend to be perfectly Victorian in design and absolutely over the top in nature. So the two that are on the screen here, an example of this, on the left, we have Queen Alexandra when she was Princess of Wales, dressed as Queen Marguerite de Valois. In that trend of dressing, royals dressing as other royals is in effect here. It's an attempt to be historically accurate, but if any of you have ever seen an image of Alexandra, this is absolutely prototypical of her. I mean, it looks utterly like her in every way. On the right, we have Lady Terence Blackwood as Flora, goddess of flowers. So I chose this as an example to show that it wasn't all historical accuracy or even an attempt at historical accuracy, but in this case, just a very over-the-top, ornate, pretty gown, a very pretty gown in this case, dressed with flowers. So all of this made for fantastic gossip, as you might imagine, and interest. And the Devonshire album offers us a glimpse into that highest echelon of society, but it also shows a glimpse in some ways of how the Victorians understood their own history and where they sat in it. Again, not an attempt at capturing an historical past that's accurate. And we can see that if we look at another pairing of images from the event, in this case, two Cleopatras. So both of these women are dressed as Cleopatra, and yet they look nothing alike, and in fact are wearing contrasting fin de siècle silhouettes. So on the left, we have with Mary Lady Paget, this is a tight-laced gown with décolleté bodice, and the narrow column skirt that would have been very much a la mode in 1897 as Cleopatra. But on the right, we have again Cleopatra, but in a very much unstructured gown with this low-slung kind of medieval girdle or belt. And if we took away some of the jewelry, which is extensive, this gown would fit very much in with the aesthetic or artistic dress sensibility that was still in vogue and being sold at Liberty at this point. So it's edgier in style on the right, the dress on the right, but not completely out of context for 1897. So they're doing 1897, each of these, but they're also attempting to do Cleopatra. And I think just looking at the contrast, you can see that if there is no attempt at archaeological accuracy here. Now, of course, very few people could afford anything like the examples from either the royal balls or the balls of the aristocratic elite. This, however, in no way stops British of all classes from enjoying fancy dress. And I'm going to shift now from these kind of gloriously atypical examples to look at what was far more common and what was being perpetuated across the social strata. Local balls were, in fact, hugely popular, far outnumbering commercial events or these royal blockbusters. They were instead held in honor of birthdays, anniversaries, inaugurations, and very frequently as community celebrations or even as fundraisers. And these kind of small scale or local outings nevertheless garnered significant attention in local newspapers. Those papers routinely carried versions of what I'm showing you here, extensive accounts of regional events that almost invariably include very long registers like this of those attending with the costumes that they wore. And this gives us an interesting snapshot into what people were actually wearing. And I'll also note that part of the appeal is to be listed. So again, it's pushing against that idea of the anonymity of the masquerade that lets you get away with whatever you want. The idea is that you are recognized, you are counted, you are registered. So this is an 1881 example from a Colchester ball, and I'll point out a few of these in a little bit. Facilitating the spread of these fancy dress balls, in addition to the proliferation of mass media and publications, was the rise of mass production of goods. So we see this especially in the increasing availability of clothing, ready-made and standardized sizing as that progresses through the second half of the century. The rise of the department store also contributes to this. These allow middle-class revelers greater access at a lower price point to fancy goods. All of this new buying power presented the opportunities, you might imagine, for savvy marketers to educate the consumer in the proper selection and application of these wares. And indeed, this is precisely what we're seeing. Voluminous how-to manuals and advice manuals spring up with costume ideas and suggestions, both in the pages of the periodical press, newspapers, journals, as well as book-length manuals. And by far the most popular of the book-length manual was by Arden Holtz, a work called Fancy Dresses Described. And this goes through 6 editions from 1879 to 1896, each of them longer than the last, and each of them more richly illustrated than the previous issue. And they're all published under the auspices of the department store Debenham and Freebody. So there is from the start this tie-in of the commercial endeavor with the fancy dress ball. So strong was the demand for these works and the interest in them that starting in 1882, Arden Holt also starts offering a companion volume for men, for men's fancy dress. So in the first volumes, there's just a section at the back for men, and then as the demand increases, there's a standalone volume issued for that as well. So as I mentioned, as the editions progressed, the illustrations become more numerous. Color illustrations are added, and what you're seeing here on the left is from the 1896 edition. This is Monte Carlo, which is a gown, as you can see, I hope, decorated with playing cards and with other gambling paraphernalia, the accoutrement of gambling. And on the right, this is from an earlier edition, from the 1880 edition, just a page from the W section to give you a sense of the range of styles that were on offer. So we have white cat, we have Welsh, we have witch, and we have white lady. And that range, as I said, is fairly representative. We have kind of ethnic or regional dress. We have some fantasy dress. We have just almost a generic, the white lady, she's in a white dress, more or less. I'll pull out the white cat as an example to note that this costume is not asking the woman to dress as a cat exactly. Rather, we have the cat headdress and a kind of furry trim on what is otherwise a fairly conventional design that represent the cat. And I'll say more about this nature of fancy dress as we go on. So there were these images, but far more numerous than the illustrated costumes were the descriptions of them. And we'll look at a few of those. This is an excerpt from the 1896 edition. That will give you, I hope, a good sense of the range of costumes, the kind of costumes that are on offer for revelers to take advantage of. So we have, starting with the telephone, a white satin dress with striped overskirt, a bunch of strings hanging at the side, headdress with the mouthpiece at the side. And this is picking up on obviously the latest technological novelty as a means of dazzling. There is the Shakespearean design via The Tempest. We have the popular amusement of lawn tennis. And as you can imagine, with the white cat, no one is dressed as a tennis ball here. This would be the paraphernalia of tennis on an otherwise more or less conventional dress. There's Talia and Thetis from the classical Greek. Talia, the muse of comedy, sports classical drapery. You can see loose, soft drapery cut up at the knee, overflowing skirt, low bodice with deep gathered basque, sash around the waist. So this would not be an unheard of silhouette in this moment. Anyway, again, drawing on that aesthetic model that had been common, if a little edgy, a few years before. Thetis, the sea nymph, is kind of drawing on that white cat example again. It's a dress in the current style, dress of foamy white, a beryl-colored peplum with bunches of coral and shells, and pale coral and shells about the head. So conventional dress adorned with elements that speak to whatever the costume would be wearing. There's the historical offering with the lady of the 13th century, and finally the more allegorical thistle which features, I won't read it to you, but you can hopefully see at least it has the Latin motto of the Scottish Stuart dynasty there. So it's indicators of theme throughout. I want to dwell on this idea of the trendiness of some of these costumes as being what was appealing for wearers. Holt's manual has a number of plays on recent innovation, and here we're focusing on electricity or the electric lamp. So that first one is just a broad characterization. If you were flipping through this alphabetized manual looking for electric, you would see that electric light in the hair is now introduced in such dresses as morning and evening star, will-o'-the-wisp, etc. And the lights are attached to a small battery. And I have searched and am still searching for actual evidence of how this functioned, because you see a great deal of mentions of electric or illuminated costume, but I have yet to find a solid example of a battery pack that would have been worn. Electricity as a theme, electric blue satin covered with silver zigzag flashes, silver cords wound about the neck, arms and waist, etc. And then the lamp, a pedestal lamp, or even a lamp shade, again picking up on what was trendy. And that lamp shade option, which I'm going to read to you because I think it sounds slightly absurd, a short red silk skirt with lace flounce at the waist and hem, low rounded bodice bordered with a ruche and lace, sleeve puff to elbow and ruffle, a red silk wired lampshade bordered with lace forming the headdress. So she's literally being asked to wear a lampshade on her head if one is to go as a lampshade. Now we might wonder if these are actually worn. How to check that? Well, in addition to those countless, endless lists of fancy dress ball attendees, as we saw with the Colchester example, where you can indeed check, and it is the case that a vast range of costumes was worn, including the most trendy, or what might seem as the most silly. But we do have other ephemera that backs up some of this, including a marvelous set of American cigarette cards from, in this case, 1889, that show women in costume. In this case, this rather silly light and shade costume worn by a Josie Hall doesn't exactly match Arden Holt's description of lampshade from the manual, but she is wearing a lampshade headdress, and her dress features some kind of an illuminated lamp. It's unclear how that's illuminated, but there is the sense that this was not purely fanciful, but people were attempting to recreate the full range of costumes that Arden Holt describes. And I'll share with you just a few more examples from this marvelous set of cards. We have, from left to right, a humming top, which again you can see is mostly primarily depicted through the headpiece. What's the Ante, which is a play on the Monte Carlo gambling theme that we saw earlier. We have the terrapin, which features this kind of fetching turtle headdress, and then bats and rats, which features what is, to my eye, a far less fetching headdress of the rat. What I hope you can gather from this range, this selection, is that novelty was very much encouraged, and quirkiness allows people's expression by these costumes. So you're not dependent just on a set of 8 or 10 stock characters, and you simply pick whatever mood dictates, but rather you're actively making choices about what costume will best express you, will best set you apart from everyone else, will best demonstrate some aspect of your personality. And this is a real fundamental shift that happens from the 18th century masquerade to the 19th century fancy dress ball. And this idea is actually made explicit in Holt's instruction manual, or his guidebook, where he writes in the introduction that it behooves those who really desire to look well to study what is individually becoming to themselves, and then bring to bear some little thought in the carrying out of the dresses they select, if they wish their costumes to be really a success. There are few occasions when a woman has a better opportunity of showing her charms to advantage than at a fancy ball. So there's a good deal that's going on in this set of instructions. There is unquestionably the desire to look good, to show off your charms in this case, alongside of looking like one's best self And one of the routine comments you see both in advice manuals and in descriptions of attendees at balls is bad choices when someone's physique or someone's personality is out of sync with the character that they've chosen to depict. And this is a routine side of criticism. This person should not have been wearing that costume. So there's this sense that you have to know yourself, maximize your assets, know what looks good on you, know what your personality is in order to depict that. That said, there is this impetus to show yourself to your best. But fancy dress unquestionably offered the ability for wearers to push boundaries. And this starts from necklines and hemlines, which could be worn far lower in the case of necklines and far higher in the case of hemlines at fancy dress balls than in normal company. And there is plenty of evidence in the documentation of these balls that the seeds were well planted in the 19th century for the state of Halloween costumes today, where we have sexy options for nearly every character. There's the sexy cat, the sexy police officer, the sexy nurse, whatever it is. And this was very much happening in the 19th century. It's not a degradation of fancy dress, but rather an aspect of the costume ball that has always been there. And there are other ways, aside from pushing the boundaries of what's socially acceptable, other ways that fancy dress helped to negotiate Victorian gender roles, which were rapidly changing at the time, especially in the last quarter of the 19th century. And we consider the contrasting descriptions for the costume of the jockey, and these again are drawn from Arden Holt. So the men's jockey costume, top boots with spurs, satin breeches, jacket and cap of two colors, whip in hand. The description for the women's jockey costume, short skirt, green overskirt with cards of races printed on it and bunches of coins between, bodice of red trimmed with gold, green sleeves, green and red jockey hat. So in other words, the male version is dressed as a jockey. She, however, is in a dress that is covered with things that represent the jockey's profession. And there are countless examples of this throughout the book, and also throughout these books, rather, and also throughout the periodical evidence of what people were wearing. And they seem to reinforce gender divides. So a woman can dress with jockey-like things, but not dress as a jockey, at least in the descriptions offered by Holt's manual. But there were other potentially more progressive uses of fancy dress, especially for women. Girton girls or girl graduate was a commonly listed fancy dress option in manuals. And on the one hand, that does demonstrate the novelty, even in the 1880s and 1890s, of girls attending university. The fact that this would be a fancy dress suggests that it's not very common. On the other hand, it would have given young women, even girls, the opportunity to imagine themselves via fancy dress, even in a playful setting, as a graduate. So it does open the door for that kind of mental play. Another figure that's quite interesting in this regard is the new woman who gains steam in the 1880s and early 1890s. A controversial figure that was often ridiculed in the public press. The new woman eschewed traditional marriage in favor of university, of educating herself and a profession. And she did have a distinctive set of garments and trappings that were affiliated with her and often skewered in satires and cartoons in the press. So fancy dress comments on this phenomenon. Again, from Arden Holt, this is the new woman, a costume. And the image here shows a few interesting things. The top half of the costume with this menswear inspired jacket, with the cravat and the leg of mutton sleeves, these are the stereotypical garments that would have been worn by a new woman. So if you just saw her from waist up and not her head, you might think this is a new woman. However, like many of the other representational costumes that I've discussed, the white cat, the jockey, and Monte Carlo, the outfit also features depictions of objects associated with the new woman. So if you look on the skirt, there's a kind of appliqued golf club and ball. There's a picture of a woman on a bicycle on the skirt. And notice the woman on the bicycle on the skirt is wearing very much the same jacket that this woman herself is wearing. And And there's also the bicycle light that she's wearing on her head as a headdress. She's also carrying a gun, which is intended to imply that she's a hunter. So all of these elements together, especially the headdress and the appliqued depictions of new woman-ish things on the skirt, these ensure that the wearer is not going to be mistaken for a new woman, but rather wearing a costume of a new woman, and that's an important distinction to make. Even if it is a nod to the existence of this figure who is pushing gender boundaries in the day. Another version of this, which pushes boundaries even further, is the beefeater costume that's in this plate. This is an 1898 fashion plate. Now here, this is a woman costumed as a beefeater, more or less. So she's wearing a gown that does more or less approximate the costume or the uniform of the beefeater. So she's not a woman in a dress with elements of beefeater culture depicted on it, but rather she's dressed more or less like a beefeater. So it's slightly more, it's doing something different. It's allowing her to wear the garment as opposed to signs of the role. Now, many of these periodical pieces, which I've mentioned, comment on the gender dynamics that are so clearly in play in fancy dress. And those dynamics are often played for comedy. So I'll show you a few examples of this. And this is one from an 1884 piece from Judy, which was a comic, kind of middle-brow magazine at the time. So here we have the elder MC of a ball telling a young woman who's dressed up as a page in trunk hose, "You see, you have assumed a male character, so of course you can only dance with ladies." So there's clearly some discomfort with the gender bending that's going on, that's made possible by fancy dress. Again, this is played for laughs, so that comment is intended to be absurd and comical, but there is, as ever, a kernel of truth under there. Now, I would note that this amount of leg would have been scandalous to show in any other circumstance for a young woman in 1884, especially given that the age of the woman is unclear. It's not clear if she's a girl or how old she is, but that would be quite a lot of leg. But many of the Shakespearean costumes that are featured in these manuals do emphasize female characters in moments of the plot where they are dressed as men. So if you think Portia dressed as a page in The Merchant of Venice, for example, and those costumes in and of themselves play on the idea that on the original Shakespearean stage, of course, any woman characters would have been played by boys. So there is this awareness of the gender dynamics going on in fancy dress, and really using the full allowance of fancy dress to push those boundaries to some degree. So even if there is evidence that some were to some degree discomforted by the freedom of expression allowed by Victorian fancy dress, when it comes to gender roles, it's not just women who were granted this degree of allowance. There's equal evidence that men benefited from this freedom as well. So it's true that if you look at the many lists of ball attendees in newspapers that I've mentioned previously, you will see a great deal of men addressing, quote, in uniform. And that was the easy cop-out, really. If you didn't want to go in costume, you would go in uniform. Others would be dressed as night or in evening clothes. So there were ways of fudging if you didn't want to fully commit to a costume. But many men did revel in the opportunity, and as I said, Holt produced an entire volume dedicated to men's costumes. And the same social and industrial changes that gave rise to mass production in the department store led to a flattening of menswear through especially the last 25 years of the 19th century. The introduction of the suit, for example, and the domination of staid dark colors meant that the days of Beau Brummel were long over by the 1880s, unless you were a radical devotee of aesthetic dress, say like an Oscar Wilde. Otherwise, mainstream menswear was predominantly a very tiresome affair. So fancy dress offers an escape for that. And if we go back to the photographs from the Duchess of Devonshire ball, we can see men attending in costumes that are as resplendent as those of the women. Here on the left is the Honorable Reginald Fitzwilliam as Nelson. And on the right, in one of what I think is one of the first examples of an art-inspired costume that I've showed you today, this is Victor Christian William Cavendish, 9th Duke of Devonshire, as one of the ambassadors from Holbein's picture in the National Gallery. And that is actually, you can probably see the caption, that is how this is described, ambassador after Holbein's picture in the National Gallery. So looking to art in this case for costume wear. And another frequent example of this is using Whistler's paintings as a jumping off point. So a lot of men would be dressed as, quote, nocturne, borrowing James McNeill Whistler's titles from his paintings to just wear black evening dress. But calling it nocturne or night gives it that kind of sliver air of costumeness. Some, of course, poked fun at men enjoying the pleasures of fancy dress. Here from 1894, the comic magazine Funny Folks depicts the opening of the fancy dress ball season, the male sex assuming characters quite unsuited to them. And this calls back that Victorian idea of matching your character and your physique to your fancy dress costume. So the idea of the fourth in from the left, a man with quite skinny legs being ostensibly a strong man holding a barbell. This is intended to be comic. The extreme mismatch between desired self-representation and awareness of what one looks like, how one is understood by others. And you could do the same with all of these characters. That there's something wrong, or some that men are maybe not up to the task of matching their nature with costume, thus assuming characters quite unsuited to them. And in my last example for the afternoon, this is an 1887 cartoon from Judy, where we see a rather portly older man dressed as an incroyable saying to a beautiful young woman in a high fashion and quite revealing costume of night, to me, the charm of these fancy balls is that we men have the chance, for once, of looking picturesque as well as you ladies. As far as the magazine is concerned, the joke is on him, is on the man, as he is another one of those men, quote, assuming characters quite unsuited to them. But he seems to be enjoying himself, and the look of impatience on the woman's face suggests that she's not likely to suffer him for very much longer. This speaker, this man, might have been wrong in that an 18th century French dandy does not suit him to a T, but the costume choice tells us something about him, a fact borne out by his comments, that he, like the French dandy before him, does enjoy looking picturesque or trying to look picturesque, something that very few other socially acceptable outlets in this moment would have allowed in the same way as the fancy dress ball. It gave him an outlet not to hide himself, but to express himself, one of those signal elements of Victorian fancy dress, rendering a version of yourself visible through costume that was both sanctioned by polite society and that allowed revelers to test the boundaries of that polite society, all in the name of self-expression. So I will stop there for today, and I'll look forward to answering as best I can any questions that you have.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. Any questions from our audience tonight? Rebecca, could I ask,
Sure.
have you read of any evidence of rivalry between attendees at these fancy dress balls?
Yeah, in some of these lists, you will see many people wearing the same costume. And apparently there were considerations. I've seen a few instances of short stories. I can't think of any nonfiction, but certainly anxiety about not wanting to show up in the same garment as someone else. And because there were a relatively standard set of manuals, it's highly likely that they would. And there are some costumes that just come up repeatedly, no matter what, in every ball.
Yes, thank you. And were people generally invited to these, or did they pay to attend? How were they actually structured?
It just varies wildly. In some cases, they would be invitation only. Obviously, the Queens and the Duchess of Devonshire's ball were very much invitation only. But then you would have at the civic level, as I mentioned, fundraisers where you would buy a ticket, or sometimes like a kind of a raffle ticket. Sometimes they were held as celebrations for graduations, for inaugurations. So it really depended on if it was a private one or if it was a civic event, who was throwing it. And there would be commercial ones as well, where you would pay to attend. But again, that would be open to whoever was willing to purchase a ticket.
We've had a question on the chat facility. Someone asks, can I ask whether you've been able to find many examples of surviving fancy dress, and if so, whether you have any favourites?
No, very few. And I see Veronica. Veronica is in the room. She probably. I'm less attending to collections than I am the discussions of them and the kind of literary and popular culture around them. But because of the nature of the exceptional dress, they tend not to be, except for the very, very highest end, like Victoria, some of the Duchess of Devonshire costumes. But just middle class, the very common ones, they're very rare in costume collections.
Chris Benneworth asks, when did the heyday of the fancy dress ball end?
With the war, the First World War, you really start to see a fallout there. But as you know, opportunities for wearing costumes continue to be extraordinarily compelling. It varies slightly between the North American context and the British context, but a lot of the kind of year-round fancy dress ball has moved to things like back to Mardi Gras or to Halloween. There's kind of specific holidays that tend to be affiliated with it, as opposed to a year-round thing. But again, just judging by the quantity of press around them, 1870s, 1880s is kind of when it starts to wane a little bit more.
Does anybody else have any questions? Chris Donaldson? Chris?
Oh, hello. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. I was really struck by the photographs of the Cleopatra costumes. It kind of made me think of the fad for toga plays and things like that. You mentioned the theater, and certainly Shakespeare's influence a few times. I didn't know if you'd be able to maybe elaborate a little bit on, I guess angling towards your work on fads, the role of the theater or of literature or other kinds of cultural production and stimulating particular trends and fashions for styles of costumes or particular characters.
Yeah, you can definitely track some of these trends as they come through. The literary, especially Shakespeare, never goes away. The literary characters are there, as well as folklore. You'll see kind of Grimm's fairy tale characters throughout all of the editions of Holt. Some of the more faddish or news-related moments, kind of 1860s and 70s newspapers become very big, and so you'll see kind of women with newspapers attached to newsprint attached to gowns. There is, I think, just in 2 of the editions of Holt, the Suez Canal is an option for a costume that then goes away. The classical, the historical, and the kind of high literary never go away. Fauntleroy, once it's published, is there and perpetually there. But the really faddish kind of trendy things and telephone, telegraph, those come and go. They're not there always. So there is the sense of chasing the latest. I'm trying to think if others that disappear. I did at one point kind of chart what stays in all of the editions and what disappears. The Whistler costumes, which at one point have quite a presence, And part of that is just the nebulousness of the titles, where you can call anything a nocturne or anything a harmony in orange and yellow. And that's really just playing on a cultural awareness that Whistler is an artist and is someone we should know. So it's not really tied into any kind of deep and abiding knowledge of his work as much as a very surface level. And those do exit Holt's at one point. But yeah, you very much can kind of see whatever's popular at the time tracking.
Another question for you. One of our audience asks, have you come across any examples of fancy dress being used to make social or political statements at public balls? And what was the reaction they provoked?
Gosh, that's an excellent question. I mean, there are a few kind of drag balls which end up being the police break them up, and those tend to get quite a lot of press. And sometimes those are framed as fancy dress balls. I mean, you have the very polite edginess of something like A New Woman, you know, which again is so subtle, and it's clear that someone wearing that could be making fun of the figure as opposed to attempting to embody it. So there's always enough, I think, deflection possible in how one is wearing or appropriating some of these costumes. I can't think off the top of my head of any examples of fights being, breaking out over someone adopting a political costume. They tend to be much more polite, and also that, many, I should have said this, but many of those reported local events tend to be children, it tends to be children wearing them. So less politically touchy than maybe there's the potential for.
And another question, if you don't mind, does it become a more domestic entertainment later in the 20th century, e.g. it still has a reference in literature, for example, Du Maurier's Rebecca, so more domestic entertainment, you think?
Yeah, and I mean, there's a good deal of overlap there with domestic theater as well, and kind of self-made productions. In terms of a cultural shift, I just don't know enough to say that that's something definitive, that it moves kind of out of the public space or the civic space into a domestic space. I just don't know enough about it to kind of argue what would motivate that or not. So someone else in the room may know better than I do. But as access to the materials becomes much more widespread and home sewing easier, the creation of disposable or non-essential clothing, it's very much in line with that broad progress. But beyond that, I couldn't speak authoritatively.
Rebecca, thank you so much for giving up your time to spend an hour or so with us tonight. It's much appreciated. It really was fascinating, and I hope that one day you'll be able to come up to Newcastle and talk to a live audience in the Lytton Phil. That'd be really great. So thank you on behalf of the Lytton Phil. Thank you on behalf of the audience. And I think someone's got another question.
Oh, I think they were just
Veronica. Just a clap. Anyway, well, with that, I shall close for the evening. And thank you so much. Much appreciated. And good night, everybody.